This brief primer on rubrics is a product of the University of Redlands Educational Assessment Committee. And we'd begin with a sort of historical fun fact, which is that rubric derives from the Latin for read and spoke originally to headings that were written into documents by hand, Bibles particularly, but not exclusively. And of course, the meaning of rubric has changed considerably over the centuries, and what we're concerned with is the form of rubric that is generally credited with having begun with a study by Deiderich et al. And in this particular study, 53 experts from a lot of different disciplines all graded the same 300 college admissions essays. They were told to use whatever hunches, intuitions, or preferences you normally would use, and had 9 possible scores to assign, 1 through 9. What's remarkable is the level of dispersion in the scores, so that 94% of those papers received 7, 8, or even 9 different scores by the raters, and that none of the 300 received less than 5 different scores. Here's an example from one of those papers. You can see the possible range of scores, 1 through 9, and at the bottom row shows the number of raters who assigned each of those scores. I put this in graph form, and you can see that it reasonably approximates a normal curve. The important part with respect to rubrics is what happened next, and to figure out what might account for that level of dispersion in scores, Deiderich et al. Factor analyzed the results and found that their raters were actually using 5 different criteria in their grading. Some were looking at ideas, relevance, clarity, etc. Others form, organization, analysis, and so on. And so inevitably then you're going to get the results they obtained, which is a great deal of dispersion. What Deiderich et al. Didn't do was take it to the next level, which would be to develop what we think of as a modern rubric, and it might look something like this, so that if each of their raters had been then asked to use all 5 of those different criteria and assigned a score for each, and then those were summed, reasonably then the dispersion of scores would be much, much less, and we would see, therefore, greater interrater reliability, which is really what much of using rubrics is about. That is, achieving greater consistency or precision in scoring. So if you look at this target here and imagine that the center of the target is the imagined true score that any given paper should have received, you'll see that actually the raters were all over the target, and the graph at the bottom is the one I showed in a previous slide for that one particular paper, kind of roughly showing what it looks like to have that kind of dispersion. What our goal would be, and what rubrics help us achieve, is a target that has the scores clustered much more tightly, so that there's greater precision, if you will, in what the raters are achieving. This brings us then to a definition of rubric, a working definition for the rest of this presentation, and that is a rubric is an explicitly stated set of criteria to be used in assessing a particular performance outcome. A rubric articulates fundamental criteria for each learning outcome and provides performance indicators that demonstrate progressively more sophisticated levels of attainment. And we'll spell this out more precisely. To do this, bear with us on this. Well, let's imagine that we've been brought in as an assessment team to help a local culinary institute. And in particular, we're interested in one of their learning objectives. And that particular objective is that graduates of this program will be able to apply and use basic techniques and culinary skills to create great desserts. Imagine further that the artifact we're going to examine is a chocolate chip cookie, and that there are 3 students graduating from their most recent cohort, and that we've randomly selected one chocolate chip cookie from batches they've made to assess. And so we can imagine then that student number 1 baked the chocolate chip cookie at the upper left, so student 2 the one in the middle, and student 3 the one on the right. And because our goal is to have some reliability in assessing these cookies, we've got some criteria here on the left, and reasonably, in evaluating a chocolate chip cookie, you'd be interested in chips, the chocolate chips, so that you can see that a beginning level of performance would be that the student would bake cookies that would have less than 1/4 of a given bite having chocolate in it, all the way up to mastery level, in which more than 3/4 of a bite would have chocolate in it. Texture would be another variable you might imagine, so that on the far left, the cookie is as hard as a dog biscuit, all the way held to the right, where the cookie is consistently chewy. Color is another factor, richness. So those are the 4 we're using for our hypothetical example here. And again, you can see that each of those 4 criteria are evaluated on 4 levels, and that there are very explicit criteria for each. So this then is a sort of example of a basic rubric, and you can see that it provides levels of mastery scaling, in this case 1 through 4. It depicts the characteristics that we're rating, and of course then it describes each of those characteristics at each level of mastery. So back to our assessment of this particular cohort of graduating students. If we assume that proficiency is at 3, and we would therefore want a mean score of at least 3 for any given student, you can see that in the far right side under mean scores, 2 of the 3 students then could be judged to have met mastery, or proficiency rather. That is, they had scores of 3 or above. So in writing up an assessment report, reasonably this program would report that 2/3 of its students met proficiency. The other interesting thing, though, is the diagnostic information you get by using a rubric like this. So not only do you have a sort of global score, the mean score, but also you can go back and look and see what areas the program may needs to work on. In this case, you can see that proportion of chips, none of the scores reach proficiency levels. And the information that provides to the program then is there may be something about its particular curriculum that needs to be fixed, so that as students bake cookies, they are able to know to have a greater proportion of chips. So I know it's a silly example, but it shows the sort of diagnostic information that rubrics can provide a program. And this brings us to a distinction that I think is important, which is that rubrics can be used in student assessment. So as we teach our classes and grade papers and assignments and so on with students, rubrics are actually very helpful for that. They're helpful to us. They're helpful to the students to know what they're being expected to do. But rubrics also can be used for program assessment, where the goal is not to assess individual students, but rather to assess how well the program's doing, so that you're aggregating scores across students and looking at proportions of students who've met mastery and so on, just as we've seen in the example before. And just here's a very brief list of the kinds of things that can be evaluated with a rubric, and as you can see, that it's quite a large range of possibilities. This is a list of 6 steps in developing a rubric that can be found on the University of Hawaii Manoa's website. And so just very briefly, step 1 is to identify what you want to assess. And For those of us who are doing program assessment, we've already written our learning objectives, so reasonably we've met that criterion. We know what it is we're going to set out to assess. The next thing is to identify the characteristics to assess each of those learning objectives. Then the levels of mastery, and then the specific indices we'll be looking at to assess that mastery. Steps 5 and 6 are important as reminders to us of things we should be doing as well. And one is, once we've developed the rubric, to test it, to bring colleagues into it, to grab various work samples, cookies, if you will, in the example we just had, but more likely in your own programs, it'll be capstone experiences that you'll look at in a particular way. And try the rubric out, and as you do so, collect examples that exemplify each of the level, take notes about where there's confusion or lack of clarity in the rubric, and then at step 6, bring it all together with your colleagues and make necessary revisions. And the final comment here is that a rubric is rarely a completely finished product, that as you continue to work with it, over time, it'll evolve as you find ways that it needs to be improved. So some issues to consider with rubrics. First of all, there are many rubrics out there now that are accessible as you do web searches. Here's one. The Association of American Colleges and Universities has their value rubrics, which are really useful for those of us in liberal arts colleges and universities, and I've got the URL here to obtain those. But there are many others, and the caution, though, is that each of us is assessing a particular program that we've developed the learning outcomes for, and so it's important not to necessarily adopt someone else's rubric wholesale, but to take a good look at it and see whether it needs to be modified and how. Second one is, as you develop the criteria, make sure they're measurable. Specify, for example, what a quality would look like, or its absence. Again, back to the silly example of the cookies. It's a proportion of chocolate chips or not. Or if you're grading a paper, it could be stipulating number of citations used, or whatever it is, that it's very measurable. And it's important that it is measurable, that it's not based on subjective language, like the student, it will demonstrate excellence. That leaves it wide open to the raters to make their own judgments about just what excellence might mean. Another important rule would be to not combine two independent criteria into a single compound one. So, for example, it wouldn't be very useful to have one criteria being very clear and very organized, because a particular product could be clear and not organized, and vice versa. So be careful of the compound ones. And this one is more about using rubrics. And as we use rubrics to do program assessment, and if we were to find that our students weren't performing as expected, there are really several possible reasons for this. It could be that the rubric is flawed. It could be something about the curriculum that needs to be fixed. Or it could be that the learning objective is something that the program wants to fix. So all three of those are reasonable things to consider as you use rubrics in program assessment. And I also want to comment about levels of performance, that there's really no magic to that. There's no consensus in the field. Certainly 2 levels is probably too few, so that acceptable versus unacceptable doesn't give a lot of discriminatory power. On the other hand, too many categories then becomes cumbersome to use. And in fact, the trend in the field is to use 4 levels. and you could simply label them 1 through 4, or give them labels like beginning, developing, proficiency, and mastery. Another quick comment would be that in developing the rubric, it's usually better to start with fewer, like say 3, and as you work with products, and if you find yourself kind of fudging it and saying, well, this is a 2.5, well, that may be a good indicator that you need to think about making finer discriminations that would occur through an added level. We also want to comment that what we've been talking about are analytic rubrics. In fact, there are also holistic rubrics, and these are ones that give more of a global score. So back to the example of the cookies. You could simply take into account texture and number of cookies and number of chocolate chips and whatnot, and assign a global score to each cookie. And that has the advantage of saving time. So if you're grading papers that students submitted, that's a very useful thing. But in program assessment, it has a couple of costs. One is attenuated reliability. It's going to reduce the reliability of the raters. You can't differentially weight the various criteria, finally, you lose the opportunity to get diagnostic information. So if you'll remember back to the cookie example, we found once we looked at the results that one of the criteria was consistently not being met, and that was number of chocolate chips. So that then gave information about the curriculum that could be fixed. And with a holistic rubric, you would miss out on that sort of diagnostic information. As we wrap this up, I want to point out that there are a number of resources on the web that can help with rubrics. One of the best single resources is an assessment site that North Carolina State University, and the URL's there at the bottom. It's got quite a large set of resources for all aspects of assessment, not just rubrics.